This is Fixer Punk on the road, not ordering room service. Actually, no, it's just another episode of the Fixer Punk podcast. I am sort of on the road, a road that's like a few minutes down from my house, because my house is being worked on. There was some water damage at my house, and thankfully we got put up at a hotel by our insurance. Things are going okay. Repairs are going well. I was going to also consider making this show not that blatant AEW video title ripoff that I just gave you there, but I was about to make this a Fixing the Fixer Punk house episode where we talk about drywall, plywood, luxury vinyl panels, and other very interesting home repair items like that, and water damage related items. But that isn't the kind of fixing that the Fixer Punk podcast really does. We're more into fixing systems and not talking about property in the sense of the house and the building of it, but of the systematic importance of it. And that's what we're going to get into is certain key principles, certain key building blocks of society and the systems in society that you need to be very mindful of as you're trying to create change or trying to advocate for yourself or for others. Because I think that a lot of times people get caught up in, okay, if there's popular mobilization, if there's popular will to do something, or if something feels morally right or morally wrong, that's going to be the deciding factor. But no, there are underlying principles, especially in American society, that basically dictate how things are going to go, and it's up to you to work with those rules or to work with the exceptions to them or to work around them in the appropriate way. And that's part of the kind of fixing we do here is knowing how to work with and around these rules, these principles that are not just regular rules. It's not just like what is actually written, but sort of the unwritten guiding principles that run everything in a society. And like I just said, property is one of those. And obviously there are theories, there's theoretical literature you can see about how to make the world a better place. There are numerous teams and teams of progressive socialist literature theory that says this is how we want to restructure society. And those things are good things to read. And it does help us to know where to go, but what I'm focusing on is where we're at right now and how to work with that to create better social change and how to improve conditions for people, how to improve conditions in your own life by understanding that when you're dealing with anything related to these systems. And so what I realized is the system really, really, really values property and property rights above any of those other things that I mentioned before, popular mobilization, above sort of a moral sense of right and wrong, except when it comes to punishing people for things that relate to conformity, not necessarily being right or wrong, but to conformity. But property is what's valued very, very, very highly. And the point that I'm noticing with that, two main points, of course, landlords and living in a place versus owning it is extremely obvious, but in a much more subtle way. In terms of workers' rights, which this is actually two things at the same time. Workers' rights are secondary to in our current system. And again, this is not right. I'm just explaining how things are. Workers' rights are secondary to the goal of worker productivity or worker production of labor. But property comes into play here as well with union organizing. There was a Supreme Court decision that came down called Cedar Point Nursery versus Hassid. And this case basically said that even though California law, again, a rule, a law, said that union organizers can periodically have access to farms to talk to workers and let them know about the union. They can periodically come onto the farm. But no, this Cedar Point Nursery sued, and they won, to say no, there's no right for a union organizer to come onto the property and organize our workers. And it's based upon property rights, basically eminent domain, which is a government taking of property that requires compensation. So they consider this, the Supreme Court considered having a union organizer come on to try to help and protect the workers. They consider that to be a taking of property, and overrides the rights of the workers, overrides the will of the legal system, of the legislature, the elected representatives of the people. No, property overrides that. That's how seriously our government takes property. So no union organizer can come on there, because that would be taking the right of exclusion of other persons from private property. Of course, the Supreme Court wanted to put in there sort of exceptions in relation to like safety inspections and things like that, health inspections, because there were concerns about that. But the way they put it is, in exchange for having a certain right, that you'd have those inspections. So even then, the actual power is in the hand of the property owner, because the property owner will be seeking a right from the government, and then in exchange for that, they're exchanging their property for that right, their property right, in terms of having somebody come on. If you want the right to run a restaurant, that you have to give the health department the right to come on there. But that's all based on the decision of the property owner, not based on the decision of society, or based upon what's right. Second key example, of course, is of this concept of property ruling over everything, and is landlords. So landlords, of course, if you're living somewhere, the fact that you live somewhere does not establish your right to be there, except in like very rare cases of like adverse possession. But what the right that's important, and any rule that's made to that is basically just an exception. Any rule that regulates or modifies that right of property is basically an exception, and it's weaker than the principle. Anything that flows with the principle is strong. Anything that flows against it is relatively weak. And you have to understand that as you're doing these things, because you're having rules and you have laws, and you have to understand that in a way they're weakened by the overarching principle if they don't follow along with the principle. You have to realize when you're having to going with and going against the currents. So what's important is who owns it. The place I live, if I was in there and not in a hotel due to water damage, what's important is not Grayson lives there. Grayson lives there is a thoroughly unimportant concept in terms of the rights of using that property. It's not really important at all. What's important is the property right. Who owns that property? In this case, family member I live with owns that property. That's the important thing. And society doesn't make decisions based upon the way our society is structured right now, based upon who lives there or who's using it or who needs it, but rather who owns property. So that's and that goes overall. If there's an exception to that, like unlawful detainers, like these eviction moratoriums that are going on, well, it's an exception and it's weak. It's time limited, and the bigger right wins over. In most cases, at least if you go out into the long term, assuming things stay the way they are, is that right is more important. The right of the property owner is more important than the right of the person who lives there, even if there's serious adverse consequences, such as in the middle of a global pandemic. That's why property owners are still finding ways to prevail against people in evictions, even though there's an eviction moratorium. That's just because of how strong the property right is, because even if, like, one of the exceptions I found, unfortunately, with this eviction situation is that people who had eviction cases or eviction judgments prior to these extensions here in California, CDC extension, those people are still getting evicted if landlord managed to get a judgment. And it's sad, but that's the way these things are structured, and we need to work to change that. We need to work to find answers to that. But the same tool can be used in your favor too, to protect you if you know how to use it properly, or you know how to work with the proper exceptions to the rule. And that's the somewhat decent glimmer of hope. So when you're talking about property, the government isn't going to make you do something with your property. So if you wanted to put property into some sort of nonprofit or some sort of trust, if you managed to get some money together for that, you could certainly turn that into cooperative housing, housing that's on the terms of your collective group of people that you've put together, and that puts you in a place of privilege and power versus dealing with somebody else's demands. This is actually where, like, kind of the whole punk rock DIY ethos kind of comes to play, because if you can DIY in a way that allows you to own and control property, then you now have the advantage. You have the extra man in this handicap match, so to speak, if you are able to get into a position where you have property. And that's first fundamental principle there. Now there's another fundamental principle that it's kind of obvious, but it's extremely, extremely insidious in so many different ways. If you thought property was insidious, this one is even more insidious, because it comes with even more of a moral judgment, which moral judgment that amplifies any of these. The morality associated with having property, the morality associated with this next thing is important. And the next thing is labor productivity. Labor productivity is the goal of the current American civilization. It's considered to be, forget about the stuff that's written in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's not necessarily legally operative terminology. Excuse me. But what is operative is labor productivity as being the goal. And that's the goal with social welfare programs. I put something on the TikTok at FixerPunk. In terms of social welfare programs, the goal is labor productivity, and everything is funneling people into work. Again, somebody needs it. Somebody needs to be paid well, living wage, pay people better. People need to not starve. People need this, that, or the other. People are demanding this, that, or the other, especially now, even though there should be just an increase in prices paid to workers for their services with the whole situation of unemployment. That should be the logical response. But no, the fundamental principle is worker productivity, labor productivity is a fundamental principle of the system. And it's always going to push for that. Even in the most ridiculous of cases. You have a ridiculous case of workers not being given property access, not being given to a union to protect workers on the basis of property. But now with this one, because labor productivity is the goal, of course that feeds into that. No union means technically more productivity in the minds of shallow-minded capitalists, but which are people who own property, and specifically productive property. But worker productivity rules over any sort of social welfare concerns in the long term, in the overarching principle of things. So That means that when you have a welfare program, you have programs for people who are homeless. You have the lowest denominator of, we need to help these people. If you have programs, you would think that in terms of homelessness, that would go based on needs. You would go based upon, okay, they will really, really take care of the homeless people who are disabled, or the homeless people who are elderly, the homeless people who are in the worst possible situation, who need mental health help. The last one's kind of an interesting case because of the last principle, conformity. But the homeless assistance, even assistance for homelessness, assistance for food, it's all basically conditioned on work. You would think that, and this is the logic behind housing first, the housing first approach to homelessness, which by the way is one of the most successful approaches to homelessness. You would think that the first thing is get somebody, this person doesn't have a place to go, they don't have a place to be. But no, because you have a principle amplified by morality of get a job, get a job, get a job. That's what everybody looking, and when I say everybody, I just mean like the common person looking at homeless people is like, okay, they need to get a job, they need to get a job. And because that's such a strong principle, that overrides it. So homeless shelters, homeless programs, so many of them, in fact, I would say the majority of them, if you look on like your city's homeless resources, the majority of them are, this is a program that gets people back to work. This is a program that gets people back to work. You need to be able-bodied and ready to go to work if you're in this program. Sometimes there are some more ones that kind of fit into the moral and the need framework, like families with children and things like that. But still, those ones will be like, you will learn to work to provide for your kids, or this program will do job training, and that will be the first and most important thing that they talk about, except for the ones that are mental health based. But you'll rarely see a program that's like, we are here to help people with physical disabilities. We are a program that's there to provide housing for people who are on disability and can't find affordable housing. You almost never find those programs, no matter where in the country you look. You'll never find something that's like, we have disabled accessible housing. Our rent is made to work with disability income, and disability income is in and of itself extremely, extremely hard to get. It's always focused on people who are, the homeless programs are always focused on, okay, people who can work, people who can make money, and getting them through that and regimenting them for that particular experience. Food programs, it's not necessarily about feeding the hungry, except for like charitable programs, stuff like food stamps. Like, okay, you have work requirements. They tried to impose Medicaid work requirements. It's not about giving people health care, it's about making them go to work. And on and on and on and on. So that's the first principle of these programs. It's not need, it's labor, productivity. And the thing is that the more you have to rely on systems, the more you're subject to these things. The more you're able to solidify yourself in terms of who you are and being able to be seen as being on a pedestal, having sort of that title in the system. Is the more you have that, the less you're subject to these things, because there are people who have tons of money, no labor productivity, they do totally fine. But anytime you are weak and you're not in the way that the system wants you to be, then you're subject to them. And that's when you become subject to the third principle, which is conformity. Now, this is the Fixer Punk podcast. We base this on punk rock ideology, punk rock lifestyle, the punk rock way of thinking about the world and empowering you to live that way. And I explained the concept of extreme independence. Extreme independence is what punk is, being extremely independent from society, and understanding these principles and what society wants is key to you being able to achieve extreme independence. Knowing that if you have property, that's the first principle. Of course, it may not help you if you're not in a situation where you can get to that, but that's how you kind of understand who's allowed to have extreme independence and who's not. People who have labor productivity that's somehow tied to something they love. That allows you to have extreme independence and not have to be subject to conformity as much. But alas, conformity is a principle. You look of course, in terms of like social welfare programs, they always want you to be a certain way. They want you to act a certain way. They want you to be just the ideal citizen, even though there are people staying in houses who are totally not like that. You could, I keep using, whenever I talk about homelessness, I always go back to referencing Darby Allin, the professional wrestler Darby Allin. He kept himself homeless, living in his car, because he didn't want to grub off of other people's generosity, basically. But if he was going to a homeless program, homeless shelter, he wanted to keep his expenses low while he was trying to train to be a professional wrestler. But had he wind up in homeless shelters, whatever systems, they wouldn't have encouraged him in that way. He managed to create his own independence through his own, through leveraging his own labor productivity and leveraging property in terms of a car, which that's where he was living. He was living out of his car, and then some connections, some other ancillary social stuff, and of course, other aspects of social standing that applied to his unique situation. But he managed to achieve the ultimate goal of extreme independence. He is the self-actualized punk. That's why I love him so much as an example. But had he gone into a system, it's all about conformity. He would have to go and work the kind of job that capitalism would want him to work. He would have had to have maybe acted in a different way, not been different from his best and ideal self. And this is why I say that, like, leftist ideology should not be a thing that's just about grieving and complaining and being upset and being sad and being weak and all that. It's a definitely strength. It's a need for creativity, a need to work around systems, a need to be extremely strong and extremely creative at the same time. But the big thing is that, the system is going to then want, the more you take from it, the more you have to conform. And that's for various reasons, based upon the preferences of the people who have these privileges, the people who give the money to the organizations. That's why having mutual aid, mutual assistance, that's between people who are like you, who care about the same things you do, is so important, as compared to what a donor or what a funder thinks, how long a funder thinks your hair should be. All these things, what time they think you should go to bed. All these kinds of micromanagement type things that occur in social welfare systems, what kind of job they think you should have, what kind of aspirations they think you should have. That's why there is a little bit of a need for your own personal strength and discipline to apply, and need to develop that in order to create this mutually beneficial society, is to actually be able to say, well, the system won't give me what I want, so I need to create it for myself. But I'm not just creating it for myself, I'm creating it for others too, and I'm going to use every resource available to me. And I realize and understand 100% that everything is completely and entirely broken, and we need to make a change. 100%, you understand that in your own mind, and I'm not going to conform, and I'm not going to become like them in terms of my mindset, but I'll do what's necessary. I'll act properly, morally, ethically, and appropriately to develop myself. And that's a mindset you need to have to actually overcome things. So you don't have to conform. You can be extremely successful. You can go from, and I'm not promoting bootstrapism, I'm not promoting moral judgment, I don't believe in any of that stuff, but you can go from being somebody who doesn't have much to being somebody who has perhaps a bit more. You could perhaps wind up being the person who's lucky, has really good talent, and they're able to do what they love every single day. Be a champion, heck, becoming a champion on a national televised sporting event through your own creativity and finding ways of doing it, and not just doing exactly the way that systems want you to do things, but doing things in your own way and putting your own hard work into what you want instead of what they want. Because that's the goal. And then you can do kind of what Darby Allin did. have even physical independence, living on a huge piece of farmland, and you can kind of do more of what you want than if you're just in a small apartment and you're paying a landlord. Of course, this is idealized. This is like the edge case of edge case of edge case. It's actually, he's an edgy case of an edge case. But that's kind of where you want, in your own mind, in your own space, think about, how can I put myself in a somewhat better position, and use some of those tools if you can. Otherwise, you work toward changing the system. Actually, both times you work on developing yourself and you work on changing the system, and understanding these things, understanding that property and worker productivity is what they want, but we want this better system. We want to care about people and what they need instead of those things, and then go from there. That'll look different for everyone. For myself, I'm kind of thinking I need to find a way to make my labor productivity in something that is not alienable by the forces of conformity, where I'm a bit more in control of it myself. My living situation, something where I'm a bit more in control, maybe even having, I don't know, I live in like the highest price real estate market ever. But maybe being in a position where I could have somewhere that's my own instead of living with a family member, and having a bit more control in that way, and trying to work my way into a better situation, and then all the while still advocating for others, still saying this is what we need to do to help others, so we can have other good examples, so we can have more Darby Allin-like storylines of people who overcame it and then saying, this is what needs to be done. We don't need another storyline of somebody saying, I overcame it by conforming and by following. We need somebody who's like, okay, yes, no, this is what needs to be changed. This is what needs to be changed. This is what needs to be done. This is what would have helped me. And creating community and DIYing our own communities of mutual aid, people who want to change things, and helping each other, helping the next person who's in the situation that we were just in years ago, in the way that we would have wanted to be helped, not the way they would want us to be helped. All right, so this has been another episode of the Fixer Punk podcast. My name is Grayson Peltier. Website is fixerpunk.com. Follow at FixerPunk on TikTok and Instagram. Those are kept somewhat regularly updated. Follow at Grayson Nation, GREYSONNATION on Twitter. You can find all my contact information at fixerpunk.com. And I'll see you again, hopefully, on the next episode. Thank you so much for your time and listening.